Many people who feel deeply, who sense the emotional weather in every room they enter, carry a quiet and persistent feeling that they don't quite belong anywhere. Not because they are flawed or too sensitive, but because their nervous systems were shaped in an environment where belonging came with conditions. Early in life, they learned, often without words, that love required vigilance. They became attuned to moods, shifts in tone, and unspoken tensions because their safety depended on it. Sensitivity, in that context, was not a personality trait, it was a survival strategy. Sensitivity is often mistaken for an inborn trait, something a person is simply born with, but for many people it was shaped by necessity rather than temperament. In environments where emotional unpredictability was present, the nervous system learned to stay alert. A raised voice, a long silence, a shift in energy in the room could signal danger or disconnection. The child learned to read these signals quickly, not out of curiosity, but out of the need to stay safe and maintain attachment. Sensitivity became a form of intelligence rooted in survival. When a child depends on caregivers who are overwhelmed, emotionally unavailable, or inconsistent, the child adapts by focusing outward. Their attention moves away from their own inner sensations and toward the emotional states of others. This adaptation helps preserve closeness, but it comes with a cost. The child's own feelings are often suppressed or postponed because attending to them might threaten connection. Over time, the nervous system becomes finely tuned to others while becoming unfamiliar with itself. What later appears as empathy or emotional depth is often the residue of this early vigilance. The adult who senses tension instantly or feels responsible for the emotional atmosphere in a room is not displaying excess sensitivity, but a well-practiced survival response. The body remembers that awareness once prevented rejection, conflict, or emotional abandonment. Even in safe environments, the nervous system may continue to operate as though danger is imminent, scanning for cues and adjusting behavior accordingly. This learned sensitivity can feel like a burden, especially when it leads to exhaustion or self-neglect. Yet it began as a brilliant adaptation to circumstances that required it. Understanding this shifts the narrative from self-blame to compassion. The task is not to eliminate sensitivity, but to help the nervous system learn that constant vigilance is no longer necessary, that attention can return inward, and that safety does not depend on monitoring everyone else's emotional state. Belonging is meant to be a birthright, something a child experiences simply by existing, but for many people it was offered only in exchange for adaptation. Love arrived when they were agreeable, helpful, quiet, strong, or emotionally convenient. When they expressed anger, sadness, or need, connection wavered. Over time, the nervous system learned an unspoken rule: attachment must be earned. This lesson was not taught through cruelty alone, but often through subtle absences, distracted caregivers, or emotional inconsistency that made the child unsure of their place. A child in this position quickly becomes perceptive. They learn which parts of themselves are welcome and which create distance. Certain emotions are tucked away, certain truths remain unspoken, and a version of the self is constructed to maintain closeness. Belonging becomes conditional on performance rather than presence. The child may not consciously recognize this bargain, but their body remembers it deeply. As adults, these individuals often feel an underlying anxiety in relationships. Even when acceptance is offered freely, it does not fully land. There is a persistent sense that connection could disappear at any moment if expectations are not met. This leads to people-pleasing, over-giving, or emotional self-censorship, not as character flaws, but as learned strategies to preserve belonging. The tragedy of conditional belonging is not merely relational, it is internal. When parts of the self were once set aside to maintain attachment, those parts remain disconnected within. The adult may belong everywhere on the outside, yet feel nowhere at home inside. Relationships may be numerous, but intimacy feels fragile because authenticity still feels risky. Healing begins with recognizing that the conditions were never evidence of unworthiness. They were reflections of an environment that could not hold the full emotional truth of a child. When a person slowly allows themselves to exist without editing, to express without performing, the old contract loosens. Belonging shifts from something to be negotiated to something that arises naturally from self-acceptance. Hyper-empathy is often praised as a gift, a sign of emotional intelligence or deep compassion. Yet for many people, it developed as a way to stay connected in environments where their own needs could not safely be expressed. When attention was repeatedly directed toward the emotional states of others, the inner world became secondary. The ability to feel what others feel grew stronger, while the ability to recognize personal limits, desires, and signals quietly weakened. In early life, turning inward may not have been encouraged or even allowed. A child learns quickly when their sadness is ignored, their anger punished, or their fear minimized. To preserve closeness, they adapt by becoming emotionally useful. They sense discomfort before it is spoken, offer reassurance before it is requested, and shape themselves around what others seem to need. This responsiveness creates a sense of value, but it also pulls awareness away from the self. Over time, hyper-empathy becomes automatic. The body responds to others' emotions faster than it responds to its own signals of fatigue, hunger, or overwhelm. Boundaries blur, not because the person lacks strength, but because boundaries were once a threat to attachment. Saying no, pulling back, or prioritizing oneself can trigger guilt or anxiety, as though connection depends on constant availability. The result is often a quiet emptiness. Despite being surrounded by people and deeply involved in their lives, the empath may feel unseen or misunderstood. This loneliness does not come from lack of connection, but from the absence of self in the connection. When attention is always outward, there is little room for authentic presence. Recognizing hyper-empathy as a form of self-disconnection allows compassion to replace judgment. It reframes exhaustion not as weakness, but as a signal that the self has been neglected for too long. Healing begins when attention slowly returns inward, when feelings are noticed without immediately managing others, and when empathy is extended to the one person who was long left out of the equation. The feeling of being an outsider often appears to be social, as though it comes from not fitting in, not being understood, or not finding the right group of people. Yet for many, this sense of distance persists even in welcoming environments. They may be included, appreciated, and even admired while still carrying a quiet conviction that they are on the outside looking in. This paradox points to something deeper than social rejection. It reflects an internal separation that formed long before any adult relationship. When early belonging felt uncertain, the child learned to observe rather than inhabit. Presence became cautious, measured, and self-monitoring. Instead of resting in connection, the child stayed alert, subtly adjusting behavior to maintain safety. Over time, this creates an internal stance of watching oneself from the outside. The body is present, but the self feels slightly removed, never fully settled. As adults, this internal distance can show up as chronic self-consciousness, emotional numbness, or a sense of not being real. Even moments of closeness may feel fleeting or unreal, as though they could disappear at any time. The person may blame social circumstances, believing that the right environment or the right people will finally resolve the feeling. Yet the discomfort follows them, quietly confirming that the issue is not where they are, but how they are with themselves. This internal outsider experience often originates in moments when authenticity threatened attachment. Parts of the self learn to step back, to stay hidden, to remain unexpressed. The cost of that adaptation is a persistent sense of not fully existing in one's own life. The world feels slightly out of reach, not because it is unwelcoming, but because the self has learned not to fully arrive. Understanding this shifts the focus from trying to belong outwardly to cultivating presence inwardly. When a person begins to inhabit their own body, emotions, and voice without constant self-surveillance, the outsider feeling gradually softens. Connection becomes less about proving worth and more about shared reality, where presence itself becomes the bridge between self and others. People-pleasing often appears as kindness, generosity, or emotional availability, but beneath it lies a learned response to early experiences where authenticity threatened connection. When a child discovers that expressing their true feelings leads to conflict, withdrawal, or disapproval, they adapt by shaping themselves to meet expectations. Instead of asking what feels true, they ask what will keep the relationship intact. Presence becomes performative rather than genuine. Over time, this adaptation creates a split between behavior and inner experience. The person shows up as agreeable, reliable, and accommodating, while their real thoughts and emotions remain hidden. This does not happen because they are dishonest, but because honesty once felt unsafe. The nervous system remembers that being liked mattered more than being real, and it continues to operate from that assumption long after the original threat has passed. People-pleasing gradually replaces authentic presence because presence requires risk. To be present is to be seen as one truly is, including needs, limits, and discomfort. For someone whose early belonging was fragile, this kind of visibility can feel dangerous. Agreeableness becomes a form of armor. Saying yes becomes automatic, not from desire, but from fear of rupture or rejection. The cost of this strategy is subtle but profound. Relationships may appear smooth on the surface, yet feel draining or hollow. The person may feel invisible despite being constantly involved, because the version of them that is present is not the whole truth. Resentment can build quietly, not toward others, but toward the self that keeps disappearing to maintain harmony. When people-pleasing dominates, the body often carries the burden. Fatigue, tension, and emotional numbness are common signals that the self has been sidelined for too long. Healing begins not with confrontation, but with awareness. As a person slowly practices staying present while honoring their inner signals, they discover that connection does not have to be maintained through self-erasure. Authentic presence may feel unfamiliar at first, but it offers a deeper, more sustainable form of belonging where the self no longer has to vanish to stay connected. Healing is often imagined as becoming better, stronger, or more acceptable, but its deeper movement is a return. It is the gradual restoration of a relationship with the self that was once set aside in order to survive. When inner belonging was disrupted early in life, the person learned to seek home in other people, achievements, or roles. Healing gently reverses that direction, bringing attention back to the body, emotions, and inner truth that were once ignored. Inner belonging does not arrive through self-improvement, but through self-presence. It grows when a person begins to notice their own sensations without judgment, to recognize emotions without immediately explaining them away, and to honor limits without apology. These small acts signal to the nervous system that it is safe to exist fully, not only when useful or pleasing, but simply as one is. As this internal safety develops, the constant outward scanning begins to soften. The need to manage others' feelings loosens, not because empathy disappears, but because it is no longer driven by fear. Empathy becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. Boundaries emerge naturally, not as walls, but as clarity about where the self ends and another begins. Restoring inner belonging also reshapes relationships. When a person feels anchored within, connection no longer feels like something that could vanish at any moment. There is less urgency to perform and more capacity to be present. Relationships become spaces of mutual contact rather than arenas for self-abandonment. This process is rarely dramatic. It unfolds quietly through moments of listening inward, of pausing before overriding one's own needs, of choosing rest over proving worth. Each moment of self-attunement repairs a small rupture created long ago. Over time, the sense of home that was once sought in the external world begins to arise from within. Belonging stops being something to chase or earn and becomes a steady internal state carried wherever one goes. The moment an empath no longer needs to disappear to stay connected, something profound happens. The world does not suddenly change, but their place in it does. Belonging emerges not from fitting in, but from finally arriving in oneself.